So after having identified the prioritized technologies in the previous step of the TNA project, we now turn to the topic of how to analyze the barriers that are preventing the large-scale diffusion of specific technologies. This is what we call the barrier analysis. And the barrier analysis is, of course, an important element of the TNA project, since identifying measures on how to support or promote the diffusion of specific technologies, a good understanding of the barriers preventing these technologies from diffusing is, of course, required. So what I will present here is the key elements from the revised version of the Barrier Analysis Guidebook, which you can find on the TNA project website. And in this guidebook, you can, of course, find additional information as how to conduct the barrier analysis. So in the next part of the presentation, I will focus on addressing the following questions. Firstly, the key concept of a technology will be addressed. Secondly, I'll speak about what we mean by the concept of an enabling environment. Thirdly, we'll turn to the topic of the main steps involved in the barrier analysis. And after this, we'll first focus on the question of how to identify what we call barriers for market goods. And after this, we'll turn to the topic of how to identify barriers for what we call non-market goods. And finally, we'll address the question of how to identify measures to overcome the barriers that have been identified. So turning now to the important question of what we mean by the concept of a technology. We understand a technology as comprising three different interrelated dimensions. The first dimension is what we call hardware, and this involves the tangible elements, you could say, of a technology, the equipment, the machinery, the products. The second dimension is what we call the software, and this involves the know-how, the skills, the manuals, the practices, the experience involved in a given technology. And the final dimension is what we call the orgware dimension, which involves the institutional framework, the management, the organization around a given technology. And we understand these three dimensions as a threefold continuum, meaning that all technologies will have these three dimensions represented, although to varying degrees. So we can look at an example of a solar home system technology, where we can find the hardware dimension represented in the case of the panels, the inverters, the wiring, the batteries. The software dimension in this particular technology will be related to the knowledge, the skills, the know-how involved in installation or operation of the solar home system technology. And finally, the orgware dimension is represented, for example, in the form of the ownership of the system, whether this is in a cooperative or private user or ESCO company. So you can look at a technology as comprising these three different dimensions. Now, we find that there is a need to distinguish between different types of technologies because technologies are different, and for that reason the barriers preventing their diffusion will also be different. And we suggest distinguishing between two overall types of technology categories. The first is what we call the market goods, and the second is what we call non-market goods. And within those two categories, I'll explain what we mean by, firstly, the consumer goods, and secondly, capital goods. And after this, I'll turn to the question of what we mean by publicly provided goods and other non-market goods. And this categorization is based basically on the main decision makers involved in investment or the fusion of a certain technology. So turning now to the concept of a consumer good, the technology examples in this particular type of technology includes, for example, solar home systems, efficient light bulbs, drip irrigation tubes. And we can see that these are technologies that are typically diffused on mass market terms, pure market terms, you could say. And they are typically purchased by private consumers on the market. So what we typically see is the supply chains related to these consumer goods have a lot of actors spread along the supply chain, distributors, users, providers, and so forth. And we typically find potential barriers spread out in all steps along the supply chain. The second type of technology within the market goods is what we call capital goods. The technology examples in this particular category includes small-scale hydropower, for example, or biomass power plants. And these technologies are typically used to produce other types of goods, for example, consumer goods or electricity. They are typically purchased by private businesses, also on market terms. But what is different about these capital goods compared to consumer goods is that they typically involve a limited number of sites and consumers. It's a relatively larger investment compared to consumer goods. And they typically involve a much simpler market chain. And for that reason, there are typically fewer national providers of these technologies. So turning now to the non-market goods, we start with the publicly provided goods. The technology examples in this category include large-scale hydropower, sea dikes, mass transport systems. And what is evident here is that this is typically large infrastructure projects where goods and the services are provided to the public by the government, either in a free or paid form. They typically involve few sites due to the size and the nature of these technologies. It typically involves a very large investment compared to publicly provided goods, for example. They are typically a much simpler market chain, again due to the size of these infrastructure projects. They're typically procured through national and or international tenders. And for that reason, they typically rely heavily on international donor funding. In the last category of so-called other non-market goods, the technology examples in this case include technologies provided by institutions, for example, early warning systems, seasonal weather forecast systems. We can also find what you may call the creation of new institutions, for example, microfinance institutions, seed banks, forest management groups. And finally, we consider individual change of practices as one particular form of other non-market goods, for example, in the case of livelihood coping strategies or shift in modes of transportation. So what is special about these technologies is that they typically involve a high degree of software and hardware dimension, referring back to our technology concept. And they span across the public domain, the non-market domain, of course, typically involving donor and NGO projects, and also individual changes in practices. So in the case of these different technology categories, the government plays a different role. When we start with the consumer goods technologies, moving towards the non-market goods technologies, the government plays an increasingly indirect role. So in the first case, for example, in the case of consumer goods, the government is involved in creating the broad enabling condition or the framework condition for the diffusion of these technologies, for example, in the form of legislation or laws. And when we move increasingly towards the non-market goods, the government is involved typically in a more direct way, for example, in the form of procurement. And with this, we conclude the first part of the barrier analysis presentation.